Welcome to By the Numbers. This is a unique new program that is going to look to help folks understand and share information when it comes to the finances, whether it's the local town government, whether it's the departments, right up to funding education, and even when we talk about putting together a fiscal budget for the Commonwealth. Now, the mission behind this program is to speak with local stakeholders and hear their perspective on concerns on their community's financial structure. Now, today's guest is a gentleman who not only served in the town of Whitman, but also up at the Massachusetts House of Representatives. We have a former state rep, Geoff Diehl.
Kevin, great to see you.
Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
How's life treating you?
It's great. The last thing I did was obviously run for the U.S. Senate, so I had a chance to go around the state of Massachusetts, meet with mayors, people involved at all levels of government in the state. And so really it was a great opportunity to do something I never expected to do. But it's also nice to be back here in Whitman, spending time with my family. And, my wife and I have a small business. So certainly something like this program is important for, I think, people in the town of Whitman and also Hanson, since we're a sister town as far as Whitman-Hanson in the school budget. It's great to have a program like this, so thanks for having me on.
I know that, and I just mentioned it at the opening, is prior to being a four-term state representative, you served on the Finance Committee. What was that experience like?
I think the Finance Committee in Whitman really gave me the ability to go to the state level, and I served on the Ways and Means Committee for my first 2 terms. And it's very similar to the Finance Committee. What happens is different state agencies come to you during hearings all across the state. So we spend several weeks taking testimony from each state agency as to what their budget needs are, where they're spending it. We also obviously have a chance to give some input on where we'd like to see them figure out how to better spend citizens' tax dollars. So the local level really provided me very good guidance as to how to operate on the state Ways and Means Committee. And so for people who don't know, on the Finance Committee in Whitman, what you do is you become a liaison to certain departments and you meet with those department heads to try to figure out how the town's going to be able to afford what their needs are each year. And at the same time, those department heads come into the Finance Committee as a whole and present what their budget needs are. And of course then the Finance Committee, as well as those department heads, goes to the town at the annual meeting to vote on moving those budgets forward for the next year, fiscal year. And so, again, being on the local Finance Committee certainly was a great introductory to the state finance sort of committee of Ways and Means. But it also is very important ongoing here in the town to make sure that there is that group of citizens that are on that Finance Committee that bring sort of a different perspective than just the people who work in local government who already may know this. But again, that's what's interesting. You can ask questions as a citizen on the Finance Committee about how the police department works, for example, or the Board of Health, and they pretty much have to answer you if they want to get their budget approved. So a great sort of non-elected board that allows for transparency in local government.
What were some of the challenges, the time that you were sitting on the board, what were some of the challenges that you recall in regards to being on the Finance Committee, looking at budgets, being able to put forth a balanced budget, something when someone would look at Article 2 and they would be able to look line by line where the money was being spent or what was going on with appropriations. What do you recall from your time on that committee?
Sure. Well, again, committees have different flavors during certain leadership times. So Bill Capocci was the chair of the Finance Committee when I was there, and Bill ran a pretty tight ship. And I would say that he did a very good job of making it very clear that there was going to be open, transparent discussion about every single part of the line items that were brought in for discussion there on the Finance Committee. Some of the bigger challenges, of course, back in 2000, I'm going to say 2008, 2009, 2010, that time period, was trying to figure out what the state budget was going to be, because we were going through an economic downturn at the time, and state revenue was starting to decline. So previous expenditures from the town based on state numbers were really unpredictable at that time. And so education was one of those areas where Chapter 70 funding wasn't necessarily keeping up with what the town needed. Now I know that sounds like a familiar refrain even now.
Yeah.
So there is while we've had a good economy here in the state over the last couple of years, part of the accountability ledger is making sure that the department receiving the money is doing a good job being efficient with it. So that's why, again, finance committees are so valuable. They provide those extra set of eyes and questioning as to whether or not the money is being spent correctly. But education was one. I think Chapter 90 funding to make sure that we were able to repair roads and sidewalks here in Whitman was something important at that time. The housing issues that were going on, people losing their homes to foreclosure back at that time, didn't necessarily affect town revenue immediately, but it was something that we were also nervous about because obviously a family's ability to pay their local taxes was something that was ultimately going to hit your bottom line budget. And so that was a concern, although we didn't have really direct impact on being able to change policy to help people stay in their homes. But it was something we were keeping an eye on at the time.
So your run for office, successful in 2010. What was it like to sit down over the past 8 years and look at the state's budget and try to understand that $30 to $40 billion document?
Sure. That's the really amazing part is that, again, when you're on the Ways and Means Committee, you have the ability to dig deep into any one department. And so when I first went up to the legislature, I didn't think that transportation issues, for example, were going to be something that I would spend a lot of time focusing on.
Right.
However, once we started to see that there really wasn't the money being spent in the correct ways as far as the MBTA, which affects our commuter rail as well, even the road construction in the state wasn't necessarily adequate, and yet the state was making the case that needed more and more money to the point where they actually indexed our gas tax to go up automatically every year without a vote, which I thought was the wrong thing to do. It took accountability completely away. And so what I ended up doing in 2014 was working on a ballot question to repeal that indexing of the gas tax because it didn't fit the mold of being accountable. If we need taxes and we have to raise them, let's take a vote on it. And if it has to be every year, let's take a vote on it every year. I think the people in Whitman are aware that we've had several years now of having to do budget override votes. It's not pleasant, but it does provide the accountability for the citizen to ask questions at town meeting. And if they're concerned about it, of course they can get involved, join the finance committee, run for selectmen. So, that's what democracy is supposed to be about, is having that accountability where the person who's paying those taxes has a voice, whether it's through a representative or themselves at town meeting when they vote. And I think up at the State House, for a long time, there really was kind of a lack of questioning. And in 2010, when I came in, people like Shauna O'Connell of Taunton, Jim Lyons of Andover, a few of us got in there, and we were not really coming from the political mold. We had no family members who were previously elected, so there was no legacy to us. We also were people that I don't think had really been involved in government before. It was very just fortunate that I had served on the finance committee to even have an inkling of where to look. But we went up there with, I think, more of an agenda of saying, look, Beacon Hill has been not representing the true interest of the taxpayer for a long time. And that's where we started to find areas that we could, create more accountability. Shauna did a great job back then with EBT cards, that we were finding a lot of fraud. Yep. People had multiple EBT cards. They didn't have their names on them. They were falsified. They were having high balances, meaning they weren't being used. They were driving up the balances so they could sell them to somebody. And even vendors, or small grocery stores were taking EBT cards and just giving cash out in exchange for, you give me $1, I'll give you 50 cents back. And so there was a real abuse of the taxpayer dollars with EBT cards. Shauna did a great job exposing that as well. So, it's nice to have legislators up at Beacon Hill that, want to, of course, pass, increased spending on everything all the time, but you also need to eat your broccoli with your steak and realize that there are times when you have to question what's going on. It's not going to always be delicious up there.
It's funny you mention that, and you mentioned two things that I want to touch upon. First, the most recent in regards to Sean O'Connell and the Department of Transitional Assistance and the scandal that we saw with that in regards to the EBT cards, but even digressing even further in your conversation, talking about one of the late pieces of legislation, one of my favorite, that was put forth by the Patrick administration, that I saw as personally, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, It was either between a $600 to $800 million transportation bill that was a Trojan horse for a number of tax increases. And you mentioned about the indexing with gases, but there was also one in regards to computers and software that it was a tech tax.
Right.
So these are things that are going on up at the State House that folks don't realize sometimes that a bill's put forth, a piece of legislation is signed into law before folks go, oh, hey, wait, we need to fix this. Can we do an amendment to this?
Right. So what a lot of people don't know, and again, this is sort of a benefit of having the business background that I had too. So not only do my wife and I own a performing arts school that she runs.
Give the name.
I'm Boss Academy in Hanston, 782 Main Street. We of course take a lot of lessons as far as budgeting, and even when we purchased a property and developed it, we had to deal with a remediation of an underground storage tank. So we had certain experiences from that were applicable to translating my experience to Beacon Hill. But more importantly, I was working for Poyant Signs out of New Bedford before I went into the legislature, and I was dealing with small businesses all around the state, and then also larger businesses, banks that were expanding, buying other banks. So I would do a lot of the conversions for them and deal with the permitting and all that sort of thing. And the reason I bring up the sign company and the work there was that a lot of people may not realize that this state, we tax products that we sell, okay, but we don't tax the labor. So labor is not taxed. So whenever we installed a sign, for example, the sign itself was taxed, but the labor to install it, that doesn't get taxed. And that's a rule for most industry across the state. However, as you said, Deval Patrick decided that he was going to tax a service, in this case, technology services, people who designed websites, who set up internet technology infrastructure within a business, all the routers and the cables and the Wi-Fi and all that. So the products that people sell, computers and the IT equipment, that's taxed, but the labor on that was not taxed. And what they were going to do is, for a rare industry, tax the labor on that. And so the technology sector immediately said, whoa, first of all, this isn't done in other industries. Secondly, technology companies don't have to stay in Massachusetts. Most of us just need an internet connection and a plug, and we can put our computers, set up our office in New Hampshire, in Rhode Island, in Connecticut, and just come back to Massachusetts and work on those projects without having to pay taxes here. And so they did a very good job mobilizing and informing the legislature about the negative impact. Now, I voted against that tech tax when it was instituted, and of course I voted to repeal it when the legislature voted to repeal it 6 weeks later when they realized they'd made a mistake. But that's the thing, you want people up on Beacon Hill who have private sector experience that can say, you're about to make a major mistake here. And we were warning the Democrats. The Republican small contingency was saying, look, a lot of us come from the business world. This is not going to be a good idea. You may think you're going to generate new revenue. What you're instead going to do is drive industry out, and you're going to lower revenue. In fact, Connecticut has really been, I think, a state that's shown the more they've raised taxes, the more they've driven out the private sector. And so whether it's individual dollars have left the state in the form of people with money moving their assets out overseas, or moving themselves physically out of the state, or moving their companies out of the state, Connecticut now is in a major budget crisis because they've overtaxed. So I know that Massachusetts has a history of raising taxes and thinking that that's always the solution, but truthfully there is a sweet spot, if you will, as to too much and too little. And we found out in 2013 with the Deval tech tax and the gas tax that really the state wasn't willing to go along with that plan.
Right. One thing that we hear a lot of when it comes to small communities, especially those that have the democratic process, when it comes to town meeting and talking about small, yeah, right, and that is when they talk about some of the things that are on their plate when it comes to finances, is this thing called an unfunded mandate. How do unfunded mandates affect a municipal budget?
Well, for people to understand sort of how an unfunded mandate happens, somebody has the bright idea that the city or town or state or federal government should do something, but they don't have an idea on how it's going to be paid for. They just think that it should be done. And so we'll get sort of unfunded mandates that come into our town of Whitman that are passed by the state. Now, the state legislature does a pretty good job of saying, Oh no, we're just a pass-through for some federal mandates. Now, one that's legitimate, for example, is the McKinney-Vento homeless transportation. So the federal government requires that states, and in states then pass it down to the local community, take care of transporting students who are homeless from wherever they're at to the school district they've been going to. And so if they end up, for example, going to school in Whitman but somehow moving to the Cape, we still have to figure out a way to transport them and pay for the transportation there. Now, the federal government finances a portion of it, and it's sent through the state down to the local towns. But the problem is what they say they want to finance doesn't match what the actual costs are. And so there's sort of a gap in there. And what the towns say is that gap is the unfunded mandate. Now, there was another mandate that came down a few years ago where teachers in all school districts across the state needed to get fingerprinted. Now, I had the idea of saying, look, you've got police stations that have fingerprinting services. Let's go ahead and just have the teachers on a rolling basis go and get their fingerprints done at the local police station. That got rejected because I think there was some vendor that provides fingerprint services that some legislator wanted to get the contract for. But generally speaking, that was another unfunded mandate coming down to the towns, and we ultimately had to have a school district pay for fingerprinting. I think there's solutions to get rid of these unfunded mandates, but the problem is, you know, not everybody necessarily wants to agree on how that's going to get done. But the problem does end up accruing in different areas. I mean, you know, transportation, or, you know, our Chapter 90 money gets earmarked for certain things, and we don't always get necessarily fully reimbursed for what we're doing with our local roads or sidewalks. There's a lot of different ways where unfunded mandates kind of like lint gather up and become a real problem at some point if the town is unable to address it and the state's not able to provide the funding for it and the federal government keeps pushing more of these mandates down.
So are you saying that there isn't a lint trap to catch all of this and to clean? Is there not a way to be able to clean this lint from our municipal budgets?
It's funny you say that. Actually, Representative Josh Cutler and I had met with Auditor Suzanne Bump, and Auditor Bump,
Whitman gal?
Exactly, originally from Whitman, agreed that there are a certain number of municipal unfunded mandates that really, in her opinion, are, I guess the term unconstitutional nowadays gets thrown around too much, but generally speaking, wrong, okay? And we came up with a list of some that we should tackle, and unfortunately, again, there isn't always the appetite on Beacon Hill to go back and say, all right, let's figure out how to pay for these things. When there's a shiny new object they want to buy, you know, they kind of push it back to the towns and say, you guys have to take care of this. And that's a real problem, especially when towns are struggling right now with rising costs, whether it's debt service on projects, whether it is the rising cost of health care for municipal employees. And, you know, I think that the state really does need to sit down and take a hard look at this. Now, right now, you know, Chapter 70 is one of those big dollar tickets that comes in, big dollar items that comes into our town to pay for education. And we get, as a regional school, a larger percentage than most other towns get. But at the same time, there has been a reluctance on Beacon Hill to adapt or modify the Chapter 70 formula roughly 30 years later after it's sort of become outmoded. And so I think that, again, there needs to be that political will on Beacon Hill to address the funding gaps. And, you know, that's been overdue for a long time.
I think this next question I'm going to ask you is a precursor to my next question, and you might have already answered it just a moment ago, but do you feel as though that the state does enough to fund education in various types, whether it's special ed or a variety of programs that school districts offer?
So it's an argument that sort of people forget the perspective of everything, and that is that up until 1990, Chapter 70 didn't exist. There was no state partnership with the towns to fund education. Mm-hmm. It was up to the towns to build their schools, to hire the teachers, and to educate the kids. Chapter 90 or Chapter 70 in the 90s was really an effort by the state to provide some parity so that towns that weren't spending enough would get a certain amount of funding. And towns like Wellesley, for example, I hate to pick on them, but Wellesley, a wealthy town, didn't necessarily need as much money. So they created a formula that said, okay, we're going to help sort of even things out so that a kid can get an education equal to anybody else in the state, not based on their zip code. And it was a great idea and a great concept, and I think it worked well for a while. But again, the problem is that over time, inequity has built up into the system, whether that's demographics of regions or cities or towns getting new populations, and the formula doesn't reflect necessarily the demand on that town.
Right.
You know, or whether it's manipulation, in my opinion, by the Department of Early and Secondary Education, DESE, to utilize grants as a way to sort of circumnavigate or backdoor some money to towns beyond the Chapter 70 formula. When they do those grants, that money's taken away from the general Chapter 70 funding. So there's a lot of ways that the formula no longer is working for towns. And I'll tell you, when I was in office for 8 years, the majority of legislators wanted to see Chapter 70 reworked. The problem is, I think, leadership up there, you know, and leadership tends to be the governor, Senate president, and the speaker. Those three understand that this is going to be a massive undertaking to redo Chapter 70, and it's going to open a lot of discussions that aren't necessarily pleasant. And I hate to say this if people aren't aware, but politicians usually like to be seen more as Santa Claus than the Grinch. And so if you're going to rework Chapter 70 and all of a sudden tell some towns that they may not be getting as much as they expected in the future, they're not going to be happy about that, and you're going to see political ramifications. But again, the overview, does the state do enough to provide funding for education? I think yes. They did nothing before 1990. They certainly are doing a lot now. And each year the budget does go up for education funding. It's just a matter of, does it go up enough to meet the increased cost of the district? And I think that's where it's incumbent on the towns to make sure that they're providing the adequate funding they need, and it's incumbent on the school districts to make sure that they are spending the money correctly.
It's interesting that you mentioned about the early 90s, because we know that you had the education reform of 1993. And if I had my druthers, I would think that there may be a second version of that in the works for a lot of urban communities, gatehouse communities, that are struggling to be able to meet the needs of their populations. But as I said to you in my last question, it was a precursor, because I know that a couple of years ago yourself and the gentleman that you share the school district with, Judge Cutler, took some action in order to be able to increase the per pupil amount that the state gives to towns. And I think you were able to bump it up from 20, which is kind of like the standard number. And my understanding is that you're able to you can put in legislation to bump it up to $40, $50, $60, depending on what ends up being agreed upon.
Pretty rare to see that per pupil go up, and so when Josh and I
stay.
Yeah, well, yeah,
because it goes right. My understanding is that there's a set level. It's $20, and it's up to the legislature to try to increase that. Someone being wise enough, like yourself and Rep. Cutler, to go, hey, can we bump this up to $50 or $55 per pupil?
We actually went in asking for a $50 per pupil, and the chair of Ways and Means at the time, Brian Dempsey, bumped it to $55. Had a great relationship with Brian Dempsey. I was sad to see him leave the legislature. He retired, and he was one of the great voices for listening to the communities, trying to reflect what they needed within the Ways and Means budget. And just to let you know how tough it is to stay on as Ways and Means chair, and he did it for quite a while, his replacement got voted out after just one term.
Goodness.
Yeah, Jeff Sanchez was Ways and Means chair for one term and then was voted out of his district. So the truth is, it's a huge budget. You know, 40, what are we at? Almost 42 billion?
42, 43 billion right now. Yep.
And it is something that, you know, clearly needs to reflect the needs of a variety of communities, coastal communities, inland communities, populations that reflect a wide diversity of people immigrating from different nations, budgets that reflect high-tech industry, medical industry, higher education that leads the country, the world. So we have a budget that's very difficult every year. And so when we had Brian Dempsey in and he recognized the needs of making sure that Chapter 70 was increased so radically that year, I think it really sent a message out there, and I was proud to have that done. The problem is it doesn't get baked in. It doesn't stay at $50 or $55 increase each year. It goes back to sort of the default of 20 increase. And then, you know, the legislators have to make their case each year. That's why, again, Chapter 70, if we can rework it and not have to depend on politics and coercion to try to get this money up and just do the right thing for the kids, then you know, we're all going to be better off. And we can focus on different areas of the budget that need more attention.
Knowing that you have a better understanding of the state finances, how the state works, what could the legislature do to return more revenue back to the towns and cities around the Commonwealth?
Well, I think one of the things that you know, I've always argued again up on Beacon Hill is that we find areas where we spend money without too much accountability. And now there's something that sort of as a prime example of wasted money was the GE tax breaks that they were given. Now GE was supposed to come into Boston and create a huge amount of new tax revenue, new jobs. That's completely fallen apart just 3 years later. They've returned a portion of the tax credits that they were given as an incentive to move here, but there's millions of dollars still lost in that transition. I've never been a big fan of the film tax credit in Massachusetts. It used to be uncapped. Now it's capped at $50 million a year. And what it really hasn't done is created a permanent film industry in Massachusetts, which is the goal. The government's really only supposed to, in my opinion, help jumpstart an industry at most. I mean, I think that laissez-faire is sort of the best. But if they're going to try to help an industry grow, make it a short time period, sunset the tax credits or whatever incentive you're providing. And in this case, the film tax credits continues to drain $50 million a year. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot, but we have a lot of these different tax credits or incentives that are all over the place in different industries. Whether it's you know, renewable energy production, I think that's great to jumpstart it. But at some point, those industries need to sustain themselves for the future, not have government permanently subsidize any one industry. I don't think that's fair. So the point is, there's a lot of money on Beacon Hill that we were pointing to and saying, look, stop investing. Government should not be an investor. They should really be more of a referee to help make sure that the playing field's fair and that businesses come to Massachusetts, industries come here for the right reasons, to grow jobs because we have great kids graduating college and not because we're going to just give them the biggest tax break. So look at New York State. Amazon just pulled out of that deal. You know, you spend a lot of money, time, and effort to incentivize these companies, and they're really out there just to take advantage of you at the end of the day.
Very interesting. And again, thank you for watching this particular program. As you know, that the show, we try to keep it within a certain framework, but where the conversation sometimes becomes compelling, last thing we want to do is put a constraint on it. We try to do a 30-minute program. I kind of foresee the conversations going so well with Geoff. We're probably going to go a little bit longer, so please stay with us. Don't go anywhere as we have more conversation with the representative, because I want to kind of jump in on, it's funny you mentioned the tax credit, because I think you and I have had a conversation that credit actually has become a commodity for some companies that basically can kind of trade and share that.
Well, the transferable tax credit is the worst invention in the world because that industry doesn't really have to settle here. They can resell that tax credit to a company in Massachusetts and then move on.
Right.
And so, look, I'm sure that you and I have plenty more to talk about.
Absolutely.
Hard to fit 8 years of experience into a 30-minute show, but we'll keep going.
Absolutely. Well, now, it's been announced that you're a Whitman resident, and so I'm sure that you have a concern in regards to what they're talking about for fiscal 2020 here in Whitman. They're talking about a little more than a $3 million deficit at a recent joint Selectmen and Finance Committee meeting. Some of the things that they're looking to tackle this deficit is with a Prop 2.5 override, a debt exclusion, and they're going to look to hopefully implement wage increases, well, actually wage freezes instead of increases that may be contractual obligations. And not only will it be town departments, but I think there's also going to be a conversation with the educators, the school department, to see if they'll get involved with this as well. What are your concerns as a resident? How do you feel about this?
Well, people who may or may not understand the fact that the school department or school district is actually a regional school district that operates independently of the two towns, they'll certify their own budget and then present it to the towns, and then it's up to the towns as to how they're going to fund it. And there's a few different ways it can go. You can just get a pure yes from both towns. You can get a sort of offer back, a renegotiation, or it can end up having sort of super town meetings where it, you know, one town rejects it, another town rejects it, and they've got to go back and refigure things. It's a difficult process, believe me, and the last thing you want to do is really extend it out to the point where towns and the school district are unsure for months about whether or not they're going to be able to fund the next year's programs, because you want predictability. Everybody wants predictability. You're paying a mortgage, I'm paying a mortgage. I want to know that a year from now, I'm going to be able to have the income to continue paying that mortgage. The schools want to know, if we hire X amount of teachers to teach X amount of kids, are we going to be able to pay them? So, the fact is we've had to go through this process over the last few years of having some overrides, operational overrides. I think one of the concerns I've always had is that when you look at the average household income in Whitman, and I wrote the numbers down here, the average household income is roughly it's around the 70,000. Okay, now that's two people working, and I think the average income for somebody is around 40 to 41,000 on one person, right? So I hate to, male-female breaks it out a little bit differently, a little bit higher for men, a little bit lower for women. So we'll have that discussion another day on pay equity. But when it comes right down to it, household income still is at a point where, if you continue to each year increase taxes, $400 increase this year, $400 increase next year, if you can't figure out how to stem that bleeding of having that predictability, sort of these overrides, not just your regular 2.5% increase each year, but then these overrides, you're going to really create an affordability problem for a lot of people in town. Now, that's not to say that the town can't succeed. I mean, they can raise taxes and ultimately people will move out and other people who can afford it will move in, seeing that there's a town with a train station that gets them into Boston. That's a great asset. Obviously, the school itself, my daughter's doing great there. School delivers a quality product for kids. You're going to attract people. But one of the problems is that, you're going to have to attract higher income people, and, the cost to live in Whitman is going to increase to the point where you may not have that 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, have that ability for the next generation to move back into your town. I lived in a town, my mother remarried and we moved to a town where it was high income, very high income people. It was on the North Shore of Illinois. And most of the kids I knew growing up had this sense of feeling that they were never going to be able to ultimately afford to move back to that town.
Right.
They'd have to have an incredible career like their parents in order to move back, and they just didn't see how that was going to happen. So, you don't want to have a situation where parents are raising kids and the kids are knowing that, it's going to be tough for me to come back and live in Whitman. I desperately want my daughters to stay in Massachusetts and ideally raise their kids, my grandchildren, back here in Whitman if at all possible. I know that's a little selfish, but the bigger point is this. Let's make sure that Whitman remains affordable for families who want to raise kids, have that disposable income they need to provide them, what they need as far as activities after school, be able to save up for their colleges, and then again, hopefully allow them to move back to town and raise their kids. That's sort of the vision I have, and keeping a town affordable is part of that. And so that is the job of the Finance Committee, the town administrator, and the selectmen, is to come up with that consensus of how we can do that. And if anyone's town department is going beyond, I guess, what they assume is reasonable cost to provide the services they provide, then those have to be part of the discussion as well.
Do you feel, and I'm asking you this as a Whitman resident, I'm not asking you as an elected official, I'm not asking you as somebody who has served on a town board, but I'm asking you as a resident, do you feel that there's enough transparency as to the finances of the town and the finances of the school district? Is there enough transparency, and has there always been enough transparency so that we would know what's going on all along?
I think any one citizen, if they want to know what's happening in Whitman, they have several outlets for that. One is they can go to their selectmen, and the selectmen that I know will work to get them the answers that they need as far as questioning, a town budget or a town service. I know that the town administrator, Frank Lynham, has been doing it for a long time. He pretty much doesn't even need to go to the books. He kind of has all that information off the top of his head. So if you can get a minute with him, and I know he's always available, you can pretty much get a straight answer from him on that. Obviously, there's a finance committee. The names of those people are listed. They are residents of the town. You can go and I'm sure email or talk to them about what their decisions were as far as approving what came to them on that finance committee. And again, I think even the department heads, everybody, Tim Greno, the fire department, Scott Benton for police, Jeff Simonak for the school. I think if any citizen asked them for time to sit down and go over questions about their budget or the services they're providing, I doubt that you would get a no from any one of them. And if you did, I'd certainly be shocked, and I think it'd be the first time I'd ever heard that.
Probably one of the last couple of questions I'll ask you, and again, thank you very much for being a part of the conversation here. Social media. How do you feel social media plays a role when it comes to disseminating information, getting the word out about what's going on? Do you feel that it's a good platform to better inform the residents, or do you feel that it's more or less just free entertainment for the folks who kind of get into arguments over small details?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's funny. Social media breaks into sort of two groups. I think Facebook tends to be one area and Twitter tends to be another. And if I can use the popular term now, dumpster fire, I think Twitter defines dumpster fire. It's less of an engagement and more of just a, you know, sort of hit pieces or attacks on people or groups. I know that Whitman has a Facebook page that's dedicated sort of as a town forum, and obviously individuals have their own web pages or Facebook pages to interact with people. I think that there is sort of the keyboard warrior mentality that whatever I type and I say here to this screen, it seems like people are disconnected from realizing that that actually is affecting another human being, that the criticisms they're saying or accusations they may make without any foundation or basis of foundation can really be not only libelous but hurtful as well. And so unfortunately I wish people would just not engage as much on social media as face-to-face if it's serious discussion and questions they have. But at the same time, I think there is a way that social media helps disseminate information quickly and effectively. So, you know, again, if somebody's, and this is a strange example, but if somebody lost a pet, it's a good way to get information out there. But if somebody had a question as to where can I find the town budget or the school budget, you know, you can put the link out there and put it out there, and people can get that information and they find it quickly and easily. So there are good uses of social media, but when conjecture and accusations happen without the party being named or being blamed, I guess in this case, as part of that discussion, I think it's bad. And so you have, again, forums like the Whitman-Hanson Regional School District School Committee. They have their meetings on Wednesdays that you can go to and engage with the members of that board themselves instead of just saying something online. Selectmen have their meetings. Everybody has meetings. There are meetings and there are discussions. And if that fails, call somebody. Look them up on super pages or whatever the white pages, whatever the now it is to look them up. Just look them up, give them a call, and instead of just accusing. But I would say generally for Whitman, you've got a lot of people who care about this town, who are engaged for the right reasons, and that's why my wife and I, you know, she grew up here. I'm so glad we ended up moving back here after we lived in New York and LA, moved back here in her hometown because I've had such a great experience raising my two daughters, and I think that despite the, you know, growth spurts that towns have or minor hiccups they have here and there, this town still provides a great place to live, work, and raise your kids and retire, and I think that's all you can ask for.
Anything you want to say in closing? Anything that we haven't touched upon, but you want to kind of at least help us button up this conversation?
Well, again, I think this is a great format for people to learn a little bit more about specifically numbers or the process by which town budgets happen, where you can go to get your answers, and you know, while we talked a little bit about my experience as a state legislator. You know, I think the other thing too, I'm sure you're going to do, is focus on having people at the local level talk about what made them run for office, you know, their experience in serving. If I can just impart any one last bit of wisdom, is that whatever you do in your life as a career or whatever, and you want to be involved because you think you can do it better, give it a shot, run for office. I certainly didn't have any experience before I ran in 2010, but I listened to a lot of people, and I felt that maybe I could make a difference, and I feel in some way I have made a difference, but I'm looking forward to helping those people in town who want to continue making that difference by providing whatever advice I can. So thank you for the forum.
Thank you very much for coming in and being a part of this conversation. And I want to thank those who are watching at home. Again, the idea of this program is to better inform the folks that we serve in both Whitman and Hanson, to talk about, again, yeah, it's called By the Numbers, to talk about the financial situation in both communities. How did we get here? And get it on different levels from the folks who know, like Geoff Diehl, who came in, sat down and talked with us. If you have ideas for guests or for questions to put to our guests for future programs, info@WHCA.tv. It's that simple. Until next time, thank you for watching By the Numbers.